In recent days, news came out that China has fully militarized 3 islands it built in the disputed South China Sea. What is the significance of this? Why is the Western Pacific vital to American interests? What is concerning in the current relationship between the United States and some Asia-Pacific countries? And what is the missing puzzle from the United States Asia-Pacific strategy? Today we sit down with Newsham, a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy and director at One Korea Network and the Yorktown Institute, to talk about these questions. In tomorrow's episode, we'll release the second part of the interview, where we zoom in on Taiwan and talk about the ways it could improve its defense against potential aggression from China, and how we can work better with the United States in doing so. Colonel Newsham, wonderful to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, as the Ukraine war drags on, it seems like the Chinese Communist Party is getting busier in the Western Pacific. News came out a few days ago from a U.S. admiral that the CCP has fully militarized the islets in the South China Sea, 3 of them in triangular position, and they've signed a security deal with the Solomon Islands. Zooming in on the militarized islets, what is the significance of this?
Well, it's important in a couple military respects, and that is that it allows the Chinese to really, anytime they want, to cut the sea lanes in the South China Sea. Keep in mind that about 80% of Japan's oil goes through the South China Sea, same for South Korea, and a huge amount of their international trade. So that you can see the importance of that. But also by setting up these militarized islands, which are in fact, these are full-scale military bases in the middle of the South China Sea. China has expanded its ability to conduct military operations about 1,500 miles farther offshore from China. So now China can reach down to Australia, well into the Southwest Pacific, and off to into the Central Pacific. And from these bases, it can cause the Americans and America's friends all sorts of problems. These are full-scale bases. To give you some sense of the size, one of them is about the total size is about the same as the District of Columbia, Washington D.C., which is pretty big. Another one is about as big as Pearl Harbor, the main U.S. base in Hawaii. These have everything that you've got, everything you need, 10,000-foot runways, all the maintenance capabilities. They've got anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft systems. They can launch fighters from there, electronic warfare aircraft. It allows China to operate from much farther offshore than it ever has, and to start operating into the farther into the Pacific region. But there's something else about this that's interesting, I think, and it shows one of the fundamental weaknesses in U.S. policy over the years, and that is that the Chinese started militarizing or building these bases in 2014. It was completely obvious what they were going to do. And this despite Xi Jinping having promised President Obama they would not militarize them. You knew that was a lie, and anyone should have known. But this is to say, it's not a surprise what's happened. And now we're acting like it is. But you will notice that throughout this period, there were people who were saying, look, the Chinese are going to militarize these. They are going to establish the ability to take control of the South China Sea, which is an area of international waters about 1.5 times as big as the Mediterranean Ocean. China has just said it's theirs, so they're going to take it. We need to do something about it. Well, we did nothing. Would we have gone into the South China Sea and, say, destroyed the Chinese construction operations? No. But what you could have done is you could have applied pressure indirectly. For example, suspend the People's Bank of China's license to operate in the United States for 6 months. Maybe expose the overseas real estate holdings and financial holdings of, say, the top 50 Chinese Communist Party leaders, put it on the front page of the New York Times, and even get it into China via the get it around the Great Firewall. So there are ways you could have applied pressure on China, but instead the Americans, the Defense Department, successive administrations, they really didn't do much to give the Chinese reason to pause. And here we are now. They have got this presence. I've heard it said that some senior American officers said, well, if there's a war, we can destroy those in a day, 2 days or so. Well, you're not going to have a war if the Chinese do it right. By setting up these positions in the South China Sea, they've got put in place a fait accompli, that they have these bases, and if anyone touches them, well, it's World War III. So you can bet that we're probably not going to touch them. And once again, think of the message here that other countries take from all of this. They say, well, the Chinese built these bases in the middle of international waters that other countries in the region claim or have an interest in. The Americans could not stop them. The Americans would not stop them. What does that do for American credibility? It's not a good thing. And this is what comes of ignoring hard problems that come our way. So that's how, when I look at the South China Sea islands, that's the thing that I look at is really squandered opportunity to do something about it. And now it makes all our problems much worse.
Yeah, there are a few thematic things that I want to get to for the rest of the interview. But before we start, I want to give a little bit of a backdrop for our audience, and I was hoping to get your perspective of the why. And so tell us if and why American military presence in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific is vital to American interests.
The Chinese objective is to drive the Americans out of Asia, out of the Pacific, and for China to dominate and control the region. It is that simple. It's hard to believe that the Americans could ever be driven out of anywhere, or that somebody would want to do it. But that is, in fact, the Chinese objective, is to drive America out of the Pacific. Now, why does that matter, say, to the average American? Uh, you'll often hear the explanations, and they're good ones, is that uh, America's prosperity, a lot of our economic uh, bounty and sort of the good life we enjoy, does depend on our business dealings, our business activities in the Asia Pacific region. So that's important, of course. In fact, it's essential. Try doing without it. But I found that there's another way to look at this. That when trying to explain it as to why it matters, and I found that if you start with the a recognition of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese regime, that's important, because this is not just another government, another country. This is a ruthless, brutal, aggressive, totalitarian dictatorship. It is just an awful regime of the sorts we've seen throughout history. And that's the thing you have to start with. It's a regime that doesn't dare have elections. If you say anything to criticize the leadership, none of whom are elected, that you'll find yourself in short order in a prison, a mental home, and even worse, you could find yourself dead. Also, it's a regime that tolerates organ harvesting, which means killing people to take their organs, and sometimes taking from the organs from them while they are still alive. You can go down the list. The Chinese regime has been found guilty of genocide in dealing with its Muslim populations in out west, the Uyghurs. So it's the nature of the regime that matters. You always have to keep that in mind. And then if you think about it, think about where you live. Suppose that in your neighborhood, or say that the neighborhoods around you, that would it matter if the mafia ran those places? I would suggest it does. And I think we would find the mafia encroaching on our daily lives. It would be telling us what to do or else, be causing all sorts of problems. This would be a very different environment that you're living in. And the same thing applies in toward the question of Chinese domination or control of the Asia Pacific. You have a ruthless regime that is in charge. So you will find that America's business interests are getting controlled, that America is being told by the Chinese, you've got to do certain things, or we're not going to send you resources that you need. We're not going to send you these supplies on which your economy depends. And you're going to find that all your friends in the region are suddenly under Chinese communist domination as well. And that's never a good thing. So what you're going to find, if the Chinese are successful in ultimately driving America out of the region, is that America is going to be completely discredited in the world. People will say, well, the US military couldn't prevent this. America's economic and financial strength couldn't prevent this. American nuclear weapons couldn't prevent this. So why should we care about the United States? Why should we rely on that? So that's actually one way that I would suggest looking at this. That remember what kind of regime the Chinese Communist Party is, and it is akin to the mafia. And then put it onto your personal level. As I said, would you mind if the mafia took over all the neighborhoods around you and then started to come into your neighborhood? I would suggest that you would.
So I guess the premise or the justification is that there's this predatory power that's constantly looking to expand its influence, on the world, and in a very vicious, sort of aggressive way. And to that note, to deal with, or I guess to strategize against that, in early February, the U.S. has issued its Indo-Pacific strategy. However, China and Russia have formed a closer alliance after the Ukraine-Russian war, which was the wild card that came into play after the strategy was issued. So, in the very big picture, do you see a need for the United States to reevaluate this Indo-Pacific strategy after what transpired in the past few weeks? And if so, how should the U.S. adjust?
Well, countries like the US, when we have a strategy, you always have to monitor it and see if it's still appropriate. I think by and large that the American Indo Pacific strategy is a good one. I think the Biden administration has actually been kind of smart, and they've kept most of what the Trump administration had as an Indo Pacific strategy. But it needs to always combine both the military part of it, the economic part, the diplomatic efforts. And the Americans don't always do that very well. We tend to focus often on the military and say, well, we have to have a big, powerful military in the region, which is true. If you don't have it, you cannot succeed, and nobody will take you seriously, neither your enemies nor your friends. So that is important, but we have a trouble melding the economic end, the diplomatic ends, and we do a terrible job on communications. It used to be called propaganda, which really just means explaining yourself. We're just horrible at that. So those are some places where attention needs to be paid. The nature of this Chinese-Russian agreement, or whatever it is, that is worrisome. It's not that the Russians and the Chinese have any great love for each other, but a temporary sort of marriage of convenience or alliance of convenience can cause immense trouble. And it does look as if each side had, the Russians and the Chinese had agreed to sort of support each other as they went about their business. In Russia's case, it was to go after Ukraine. And the idea was that the Russians would return the favor when and if the Chinese go after Taiwan. But there's some fundamental sort of differences between the Chinese and the Russians, which may put a limit on how far they can cooperate. But nonetheless, this marriage of convenience is something very troubling, and it simply highlights the importance of the Americans getting their Asia-Pacific effort sort of in order. And to date, it's laid out pretty well, but as a practical matter, the implementation has not been nearly as good as it should be. Additionally, we have a lot of friends and partners in the region and people who would like to work with us, but when they see that the Americans are kind of sometimes confused and don't seem to quite know what they're doing, that it causes people to stand back a bit and hope that America, as I said, gets its act together. Just speaking a bit about the military end of it, that the U.S. has been talking about this pivot to the Pacific for an awfully long time, but it really hasn't resulted in a sort of really very, very great increases in the resources that we have out here, particularly from the naval end and air forces as well. So there's a lot of talk about it, but there really hasn't been the corresponding results that one would think, particularly when you look at Navy ship numbers. The Chinese Navy is now bigger than the US Navy by far, and they don't have to cover the whole world. So that's just one area. The Americans do need to do a better job of bringing their partners together so that they can operate in a really effective way. To date, it's to some degree they can operate together, but there's never been a sense until recently that we just might have to fight together against China. And it's a little late in the day to get started on that, but we see what the problem is, and there's certainly work to be done there. So really a coordinated effort that say joins together those parts that I mentioned, the military, economic, propaganda, or communications, and the diplomatic. That's really is essential. And if you get that right, you're going to find your friends want to join in. It's going to make the partnerships that we have out here much more effective.
Right, and I really want to go into your point of that the United States has been offering some degree of military support to countries in the Indo-Pacific region, but yet these countries, they maintain a very high degree of, well, they have been increasing in their economic dependency with China. And some may say that even ideologically, they're starting to align with the Communist Party, or even though not completely, but there may be a, so to say, a diverting trend, away from the United States. So, do you see this as concerning? And if so, do you think the United States should do something about this almost decoupling of the economic and sort of military spheres of influence that the United States have over these countries?
Well, that's a huge problem. What you've just described, it is that most of the countries in Asia, they have substantial economic dealings with China, and people like to do business. They like to make money, so you get kind of hooked on that. At the same time, in most places, there isn't a great love for China. There's suspicion of it, so they like to have the Americans around providing the security support, providing defense. So they're effectively trying to have it both ways, sort of doing business with China, but saying to the Americans, well, you guys will protect us from these people, won't you? At some point, most countries you're going to have to come down on one side of the fence or the other. And that is a decision that has been put off for much too long. The Americans haven't really done much to help people make that decision. But say that's the dilemma: is how long can you straddle? Can you stand on top of the fence? I would suggest not forever. What you're going to find, if you're one of these countries that thinks it can sort of play off both sides, make money from China, and have the Americans defend you for free, that's not going to work forever. And what you're going to find, particularly if the Americans are pushed out of the region or sort of humiliated by the Chinese, that you're going to find the Chinese then saying, well, guess what? You're going to do business with us, and we're going to provide the security. We'll make all those choices for you. So the countries that think they're being pretty smart, too clever by half, to play off the Chinese and the Americans, they may find themselves not having much of a choice. In fact, having no choice at all, where the Chinese are the ones who are calling the shots. But what the Americans have to do, and it's something that really undercuts their efforts out here, is they have got to sort of wean themselves quickly off of Chinese money, off of Chinese business. Over the last 30 years, America's business class, financial class, and even much of its political class has gotten itself hooked on Chinese money. The idea that if you do business in China and overlook all of these human rights problems, violations and just atrocities, and overlook the fact that China wants to drive America out of the Asia Pacific, wants to really destroy American business. If you overlook all that, the idea is, well, we can make some money from China. And you can see the problem. How do you defend yourself when you've got your snout in the trough of Chinese money? And how do you tell countries in the region, look, be our friends, just don't listen to China, don't get too close to China? Well, we have made that we've made that mistake, and we still are. We have not, say, gotten ourselves off of that addiction to Chinese money. So that is a problem, and it's going to take somebody in Washington to wake up and to force U.S. business, U.S. financial entities to remember what country's name is on their passports and that they are patriots. And we are going to have to, as I say, stop this addiction to Chinese money. I'm old enough, of course, to remember how things were before, say, 1990, when everyone rushed into China. That it was a pretty good world, it was a pretty good life, and you don't have to have China and Chinese business to have this sort of success, to have a decent life. It'd be nice if people remembered that. So that's the one of the fundamental problems in the region when you're trying to draw people to your side is, well, they kind of like this Chinese money at the same time. They don't want to get China angry. So therefore, there's a limit on how much they will actually do with you. But you can only, say, play both sides of the fence for so long. And I don't know how much longer that's going to be. I would suggest not nearly as long as people might think.
Fascinating. So are you suggesting that while in the Indo-Pacific and America shares almost a very similar problem with the fact that they're basically taking money from the Chinese Communist Party, and in order to retain American influence or to grow American influence in the Asia Pacific region, first of all, let's say Wall Street has to be decoupled from some of the money that they're getting from China.
Well, that's true. There is no other way to put it. Decoupling has this sort of dirty meaning these days because it's misused, and it's presented as a sort of a straw man. People saying, "Well, you can never completely isolate yourself from China." Well, nobody's talking about that. But what we have now is a thoroughgoing addiction. And without the foreign exchange, the foreign currency that China receives from the U.S. financial community, from the business community, the Chinese Communist Party could not succeed. It would find itself unable to pay for all these things that it needs to pay for in foreign currency, a convertible currency, because the Chinese yuan is not convertible. And that is a huge vulnerability. But because the Chinese communists get several $100 billion at least in dollars principally every year, it allows them to paper over the inefficiencies, the corruption, the problems in their system. So it seems as if China is very successful, but take away that, say, foreign exchange, try paying for things in Chinese currency, and you will find that China has to make some very difficult choices for the Communist Party. It's either do you build up this military with this foreign currency you're getting, or do you make it so your citizens have a better life? And we hear so much about China having raised whatever it is, 600 million people from poverty. Well, yes, but what you don't hear is that there's still about 600 million Chinese who live on $5 a day. The Chinese have just redefined the definition of poverty. And that's where the focus ought to be. But we are effectively funding the growth of the Chinese military. We have allowed the growth of the Chinese economy that poses a real threat to the United States and to the free world. And that is, say, it's one of the contradictions on the U.S. side when we talk about the threat from China and doing something about it. And often what is talked about is building a bigger navy, building better weapons or different weapons. It's the military part that gets too much of the focus, while at the same time, we're funding the Chinese. And how can one possibly prevail if that's what you're doing? And that is, say, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Nobody has done much about it. The Trump administration understood it, tried to do some things, but they faced fierce opposition, even from within the administration, but principally driven by the Wall Street crowd, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, etc. So, how do you win if that's the situation? I say that doesn't get anywhere near the attention it deserves when considering the challenge we face from China. As I said, too often people will compare the militaries and see who has the advantage. Well, I would suggest that even if we have some advantage, that if we are still economically dependent, or we think we are, we've made ourselves dependent on China, it's very hard to succeed. And also, China is playing this card very well throughout Asia. There is not a single country in Asia or in the Pacific Islands in particular where the Chinese do not have substantial influence, which is the result of their commercial inroads that they've been able to make. And to their credit, they have, Chinese people have gone out to the far ends of the region and they've done business. U.S. businesses have not been quite so energetic on that front. So while Americans too much focusing on the military threat, that you're finding the Chinese are very carefully and cleverly and effectively playing an economic card that is undercutting the traditional support for the United States. And in too many of these places, people are thinking, well, it's China's the ones that do business with us. China's where we get our money from. Maybe the Americans, well, maybe their time has passed. The game is not over yet, of course, but America needs to get in and play it better than it has to date.
But right now, I kind of want to get your insight on the issue of Japan because you've actually been working quite extensively with the United States and Japanese military in developing their military capabilities. So Japan is one of the anchor points that United States have in the Western Pacific. America can project its military power through in the Western Pacific through Japan. And with this kind of de facto new alliance between Russia and China in place, how effective do you think the United States Japan military alliance can be in deterring aggressors? And do you see any room for improvement in this relationship?
US Japan relationship probably is the key to stability in the Asia Pacific region. It is probably the key to America being able to maintain its presence in the region and to really ward off Chinese aggression. That's how important it is, and it's finally the relationship has finally come into its own. For too long, it was sort of taken for granted. There was a belief that we're not really threatened by anybody all that much, and for too long, people could sort of ignore the oncoming problems, which were actually obvious at least 15 years ago. But if you join together the U.S. and military forces, you join together their economic might, the diplomatic strength, and also keep in mind that Japan it's a democracy. It's a consensual government with all the human rights and individual liberties that we value. That is what Japan is. That is what it has been for 75 years now, and it is really a much higher manifestation of human decency than that big country off to the west of it. But that's how important the U.S.-Japan alliance is. That by ourselves, the Americans would be hard pressed to hold their own in the region. But with Japan, suddenly everything gets a lot better. Our odds improve. And if the Americans and the Japanese are solidly linked, you're going to find other countries want in on that as well. Australia is, of course, a good ally, but Singapore as well is watching closely to see what happens. And they've been supportive, but to say they're watching closely. And you find many smaller countries as well are looking for this solid US Japan relationship. And ideally, one would like to see a South Korean role in this as well. South Korea is an admirable democracy. And it'd be nice if everyone could put the historical issues to the side a bit. They'll never completely do that, but put them aside and realize that the free nations have to band together. But everything does depend on that U.S. Japan alliance. Where does it need improved? I think from a diplomatic standpoint and just the basic connection, I think it's pretty good. But militarily, and that's the one that a lot of people are interested in, the Japanese military, it looks good on paper. It's pretty big, and it's a very professional force, but it doesn't have the capability really of conducting real military operations. And it needs to do some things to fix itself. It particularly needs to address the problem of missing recruitment targets by 25% each year. And that's mostly because it's not because Japan's population is shrinking, but rather the terms of service, salaries, benefits, housing, etc., are so bad in the Japanese military that people don't want to join. Also, for decades, Japanese officials and politicians have really belittled the Japanese defense forces, really tried to humiliate them, but instead give them some support, actually psychological support and tangible concrete support in terms of money and respect, and allow them to develop into a fully professional force that is solidly linked with the United States. Do that, and American and the free world and Japan's prospects in the region improve immensely. But there are some real things that need done. I would point to one sort of obvious issue is that you would think that after 60 years or so of the US-Japan Defense Alliance, that there would be a joint headquarters in Japan where Americans and Japanese servicemen sit together and they conduct the defense of Japan, the training, the exercises, the deployments. There is no such place. There is no joint headquarters. So that tells you just how much needs to be done. If something that basic has not been put into place after 60 years, there's a lot that needs to be done and fast. Really, things have not been allowed to develop anywhere near where they need to be to take on the threat from China in particular. But there's a Russian angle, but it's mostly Chinese that has been obvious for at least the last 15 years. The Americans have never been too assertive about what they need from the Japanese, and the Japanese have been happy to let the Americans sort of take care of things. Japan does have a defense force, but if there were any gaps or things that needed addressed, well, the Americans would take care of them. It was sort of a pathologic dependence, and only now are we coming out of that. But it's late. But it's not too late, but it is late. We do need to hurry. So that would be my sense of it. You've got to have that solid U.S.-Japan alliance. Japan needs to do more to build up its own defense. But Japan's economic and diplomatic contributions to really the cause of the free world in the region, those often don't get the attention they deserve. But Japan is really well liked and respected in the region. The Chinese and some of the Koreans, of course, aren't too crazy about them. But everywhere else, go down the list, India, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Japanese are very well liked, Philippines as well. So the Japanese do play a role quietly that they don't always get the credit they deserve for that.
So on that note, last October, China and Russia did a joint naval exercise that went around almost a full circle in Japan's main island of Honshu. If we do some kind of a scenario-based analysis, do you see Russia, potentially in aggression to Japan, taking resources away as to tie up Japan's resources to support Taiwan in combat? Or in conflict with China, and do you think, what do you think of the possibility of that scenario, and what do you think the United States' response should be?
Well, it's certainly possible. In the event, say, China makes a move on Taiwan, one would expect, as things are today, that the Russians would make a move of some sort, just enough to distract and to divert Japanese and U.S. resources from Taiwan. So instead of being able to focus on Taiwan, you have to pay attention to and deal with even some Russian movements or deployments. The Russians don't even have to shoot. They just have to move around a bit in a way that forces you to pay more attention. Similarly, in the event of a Taiwan scenario, you could expect North Korea to do something, which would also force the Japanese and the Americans, not to mention the South Koreans, to divert attention away from what is going on in Taiwan. So what you really need to do is to make sure that U.S. forces in the region are adequately resourced. In other words, there's enough of them with enough equipment to be able to take on all comers. And that does require some additions. But also getting the Japanese capabilities in order, improving Japanese warfighting capabilities, would be immensely important. And that also requires making the Japan self-defense forces bigger, particularly the Navy and the Air Force. But also improving their capabilities is the big thing, so that they are ready and able to, take on the Russians and handle events on the Korean Peninsula, and also handle things that are going on in Taiwan at the same time. That's obviously a tall order. But if you do have to have partners to address all of these threats, Russia, North Korea, China, that America has too often not required enough from its partners in the region. And I say Japan in particular is one of them. But there's other countries that can play a major role. If not providing resources, at least providing operating bases, places from which the Americans can operate. And there's other countries, say in the region, the Philippines come immediately to mind, where the Americans haven't done everything that they should in order to have the ability to operate in the event of a contingency, or even better, before a contingency happens. If you can operate and you're ready to go before something happens, the other side just might say, well, it's really not worth it. And this is not entirely a military problem. It's really American diplomacy. And successive American administrations have not really done what they've needed to do to get things lined up in the Asia Pacific region so that the Americans and their friends can take on the threats that are coming. The Trump administration was by far the best of the administrations that I'm familiar with, going back to the George H.W. Bush era. But it only had really about 3 years to get things done, and that's not a very long time, but it did do a lot of good.
I think the point you mentioned about developing Japanese militaries, one key aspect of this, would you say, would be the amphibious operations? I just want to go off the tangent a little bit, because I think you were basically setting up that program for the Japanese military, right? When you were working there.
No, that's right. Yeah, I helped them create something kind of like a Marine Corps. It's an amphibious force. That was about 10 years ago. And they brought it to fruition, and it's turned out to be a pretty good, capable little force. And it's potentially very useful for operations say, down in southern Japan, where you have a lot of islands, you have a lot of ocean. That's what amphibious forces are for, is to be able to operate in those areas. And it is, I say, a useful piece of the puzzle. If you think of a carpenter who has a bunch of tools in his toolkit, that's what a national defense is. That you need to do a number of different things, and you never quite know which one is going to be called upon. But if you don't have the ability to operate, say, from ship to shore or from shore to ship, and to move around rapidly across the oceans and cause an enemy all kinds of trouble, if you can't do that, you can see it's like a carpenter who doesn't have a screwdriver. He's got a hammer and he's got saws, but he doesn't have this one thing he must have. So that's what the Japanese needed, and that's what we helped them get. But also we had another reason for creating the Japanese amphibious force, or better said, supporting those Japanese that knew they needed an amphibious force, but needed some cover and some help to bring it to fruition. And that is that in order to have an amphibious force, you have to have the Navy, the ground forces, and an Air Force all cooperate together. So you have to have these three services, these three capabilities, able to operate in just complete coordination, operate smoothly. And the Japanese military was not able to do that. The Japanese Army, the Japanese Navy, and Air Force could not conduct what are called joint operations. And if they couldn't do that, it meant that the Japanese military was not nearly as effective as it needed to be. So we thought that by helping Japan get an amphibious force, it is going to force them to have the Navy and the Army and the Air Force, or the Army's Air Force, cooperate for the first time in history. And that was part of the objective, and did have some success. So there was not quite an ulterior motive, but a secondary reason. And we thought it was a way to address a fundamental problem in Japan's defense capabilities that had not been addressed to that point. So they have made a lot of improvement in that area. This ability to conduct so-called joint operations. There's a long way to go, particularly when it comes to conducting joint operations with the Americans. But they are a lot better off than they were 10 years ago, and they are making pretty quick progress. By nature, I'm not a cheerleader, and do recognize there's a lot of work to be done, but I am impressed with what has been done in the last few years. And I would also, and I have to say this in case anyone from the Navy is listening, that the US Navy and the Japanese Navy have an excellent relationship, particularly operationally, which means they can operate together. And they are the model, really, of what all the US and Japanese forces should be aiming for. So I do want to give that credit where it's due, is the two navies have always had an excellent relationship. The Japanese Navy is, of course, much too small for what it needs to do. It should probably be doubled in size, both personnel and number of ships, to meet Japan's requirements. They can't rely on the Americans to take care of things anymore. That the Japanese Navy and the US Navy have an excellent relationship. They are able to operate together in every respect very well. And they're the model for what the entire US military, the entire Japanese military should be able to do. So if you want to see what needs done, look at the two navies. But what I was also stressing is that the Japanese Navy is much too small. It probably needs to be doubled in size, both number of sailors, but also number of ships. It's got too many missions, too many things it has to take care of these days. And the 50, 60 ships that it has is not anywhere near enough. And that needs to be addressed. The Japanese cannot think that the Americans are going to take care of things for them, but they do need to devote some resources and effort and spend some political capital to get this done. But I think if they persuade the Japanese public, who often have a very good sense of Japan's defense requirements, when it's explained to them, I think that there'd be a lot of public support for doing this.
And you talked about this chemistry between United States and Japan. Well, the United States also has this bilateral agreement with Korea, so it's almost like, but there seem to be much chemistry in between Japan and Korea, as you touched on briefly, due to historical reasons. But wouldn't the trilateral agreement be immensely helpful in the face of rising aggression and rising ambition that's obvious from the Chinese Communist Party?
Oh, it would be immensely important. It's essential, in fact. This threat that is coming from China is one that I really can't overstate the nature of it and just what a danger it is. And for the Americans, the Japanese, and the Koreans to cooperate on defense in particular, but there's an economic angle to it as well. But particularly on the defense side, that would really be important to do. And in the past, there have been times when the Koreans and the Japanese have actually gotten along pretty well, both at the political level, but also the military side of it as well. They have been able to sort of do some things together. They've had these counterpart relationships between parts of the Japan Self-Defense Force and the Korean military. And there's a basis from which to improve the relationship. The Americans have been trying hard. Every administration has. And I think, though, that there may be some better opportunities these days with the recent election of a conservative president in Japan and in Korea, who has said that he's going to try to sort of improve things with the Japanese. One really make no mistake that the feeling towards the Japanese in South Korea isn't something that people can just get over, just forget about. But it's sometimes a country and a people do have to sort of bite their tongue a bit and for a sort of a bigger purpose, which in this case is to really defend democracy, individual liberty, and freedom in Northeast Asia and all of Asia. And the Koreans really have a sort of a big role to play in that if they choose to. So this has been a challenge for the 30, 35 years I've been following things out here. But there's room for improvement, and I like to be cautiously pessimistic. I'm joking, but I think they can improve things, partly because they could hardly have been worse than they've been for the last few years. But I think that things can be improved, and the Americans, of course, have a role to play here. Both in encouraging, but they may need to speak pretty directly to some of the parties to make it clear that if you expect Americans to die for you, that you're going to have to sort of overlook some of these resentments that you've got. And that is something that I don't know the Americans have ever done it well enough, but they do need to speak clearly on that front. And it is about that simple. America is expected to die on behalf of democracies in Northeast Asia. So we would expect, as a sort of a commensurate response and contribution, we would expect them to cooperate where it meets everybody's needs.
Well, with that said, thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the opportunity.
Yeah, just a note to our audience, we are doing a second part of this tomorrow with the Taiwan, where Colonel and Newsham and I will be talking about the situation in Taiwan, so make sure to tune in.